With new cards in hand, Nebula already had a clear plan for what was to come. Now, Nebula must prepare for what's to come. Through Locust Swarm reconnaissance, he discovered that a major battle had broken out in the western region of the continent. Although he wasn't sure if he had grasped the full situation, he knew this battle involved 5 players, split into 3 factions. They were fighting at the borders of their respective territories, each trying to occupy open land behind their opponents. However, Nebula wouldn't easily disrupt this delicate balance before they reached his domain. As for the east, the sea was a barrier. Nebula thought it best to focus on developing the land in the early stages. As for the south and north, the north was already completely under Nebula's control, while the south had some NPC tribes. His plan was to send Rakra to gradually conquer these tribes, solidifying the territory for the Lizardmen and humans. Lastly, the issue with Eldar needed to be resolved. Meanwhile, due to the defeat of the Elves, they were forced to relocate to the northernmost part of the continent. This area was harsh for them, and they were very dissatisfied with this decision. But under the threat of the Lizardmen's spears, they had no choice but to accept reality. The newly appointed elven leader, Leonar, told her people that the dancing shadow god had guided them to a new way out, and foretold that a group of people from the south would come to help the elves. Just as she finished speaking, a guard hurried in to report a group of people had arrived to visit the tribe. Leonar immediately understood that these were the helpers they had been waiting for. Despite the elves' current financial constraints, Leonar still prepared a grand welcome ceremony for the humans. As Wei Kyung just took off her hat, Leonar immediately recognized her, and Wei Kyung did not expect her to become the new leader of the elves. Leonar hurriedly warmly invited them to rest in the tent, but a lizard man stopped her. They would not let Wei Kyung enter until they were sure there were no dangers inside the tent. Leonar looked at the stern expression of the lizard man, Siran Mule, worried he harbored hostility towards the elves. However, after inspecting the tent, Siran Mule's expression relaxed due to the warmth of the cabin, and Leonar then realized that he was just unhappy because of the cold. Leonar carefully asked, "What wind has blown you here?" Wei Kyung confidently replied, "It's the blue insect god. He specifically helps the weak and abandoned. So, we've brought some agricultural tools that help with production, as well as seeds that can survive in cold climates." Leonar's face lit up when she saw the seeds, but when she heard Wei Kyung mention we can give you a discount, she was stunned. "You're a merchant too. Naturally you understand my meaning. After all, there's no such thing as a free lunch." Hearing this, Leonar clenched her fists. The elves had nearly been impoverished after their defeat, and just migrating here had depleted most of their resources. Wei Kyung gently put the seeds back in her pocket, with a hint of regret in her tone. "If that's the case, then it's a pity, but we might not be able to make a deal. After all, our time is also precious." Seeing Wei Kyung take back the seeds, Leonar couldn't sit still. "I know why you came to this remote land. You must want something. After all, I'm a merchant too. I don't think you would come all this way, especially for an uncertain deal, especially for a chosen one from the Black Scale tribe." Wei Kyung smiled at this. "Didn't you say it yourself? You have nothing to give us, so what should we take?" Leonar pulled out a piece of silk from her bosom. It was an intelligence map of the elves' resources, clearly marking the locations of some minerals. "We can trade these with you at a cheaper price." Hearing this, Wei Kyung couldn't help but laugh louder. "Are you insane? Are you trying to sell me the future and your trust?" Leonar, however, affirmed without hesitation, "Yes, I stake my name as a guarantee." Wei Kyung was silent for a moment, seemingly seriously considering her words, then said, "All right, I agree." However, the slight gleam of triumph in her eyes seemed to suggest that everything was under her control. "Words alone are not enough. I need something tangible as evidence of the promise." Leonar had no choice but to comply, knowing that minerals would become more precious in the future, but they needed a future now. "Believe in the dancing shadow god. She will not abandon us." Eventually, both pressed their handprints on the contract and solemnly swore to their respective gods. At the same time, a system dialog box popped up. "The first credit trade in the third continent's north shore has been made." Up to this point, in the Lost World, the concept of the world was limited to one's own tribe, with other races merely seen as threats. This barrier had resulted in very rare trades with nomadic tribes. But now, with the stabilization of settled tribes and the nomads' migration along the paths, their trades began to be recorded. The value of reputation and credit was gradually being established, and the structure of the entire world was quietly expanding. And Nebula, the instigator behind all this, pondered, "How can I rule this wide world?" Meanwhile, under Rakrak's leadership, the Black Scale tribe fought their way through and eventually took down the southern continent. Looking at the scattering goblins on the ground, Rakrak knew it was all over. He took off the buffalo bone mask from his face and walked alone towards the end of the continent. Blood still stained his clothes. Standing at the edge of the vast sea, Rakrak looked up and murmured softly, "Is this the end of the continent?" Under his leadership, the Black Scale tribe, with the will of the blue insect god, had conquered the southern continent. Now, the name of the Black Scale tribe was known far and wide. However, as all warfare came to a close, Nebula found himself faced with new challenges. What should I do next? Nebula silently looked at Rakrak, as if he also knew the doubt in his mind. Rakrak's achievements in conquest forced Nebula to face a choice. Should he implement a feudal system or establish a monarchy? The advantage of a feudal system is that the king can select a few feudal lords and grant them land. In this model, each lord guards their own territory, which reduces the king's burden. However, the relationships between the lords are difficult to manage, and frequent internal wars could plunge the nation into chaos. While wars can somewhat drive technological development, the management challenges are immense, and once things spiral out of control, the consequences could be disastrous. A monarchy, on the other hand, was the option Nebula leaned toward. A central government rules the entire nation, with a stable and clear power structure. The administrative system with defined roles allows for more efficient management. Moreover, a powerful central government can quickly mobilize the army to handle emergencies. However, establishing this system requires vast resources, time, and full control over localities, and the Black Scale tribe was far from having those conditions at the moment. There was much to prepare, including roads, ports, the legitimacy of the king, and the selection of bureaucratic officials. He turned to Eldar and asked, "Which do you think is better?" Eldar shrugged, not answering directly. She thought it wasn't because she didn't know the answer, but because she felt Nebula already knew it. She just didn't understand why he still needed to ask her. On the other side, Rakra gathered all the Lizardmen for a meeting. He had a strange dream last night, and after hearing it, the Lizardmen silently looked at him because they knew it wasn't an ordinary dream, but a divine revelation. Jill was the first to speak and asked, "What kind of dream was it?" Rakra lowered his head, drawing something on the ground with a stick. "I dreamed that I flew up, passing through countless mountain villages and wilderness, places that we had once traveled through." Hearing Rakrak's story, the other Lizardmen were filled with curiosity. Although it sounded somewhat absurd, they believed it without question because it came from Rakrak's mouth. After a moment, Rakrak stopped his actions and pointed his tail at the end of the drawing, saying, "Here, this is the place where we are now." However, he was confused about the name of this area and didn't know what to call it. At this moment, a lizard man raised his hand and said, "The dwarves called it Maganen, meaning the end of the land." Rakrak then wrote the name on the ground, Maganen. Then, Rakrak took another step forward and drew a point on the ground with his stick. "This is where we drove out the redskin orcs. Does anyone remember what this place is called?" "The orcs called it Saman. I've heard of many places called Saman. This area is in the southern part of the continent, so let's call it South Saman." Then, Rakrak marked other unnamed places on the map. After discussion, most of the areas were quickly named. Now only one place remains. "Does anyone know what it's called?" Everyone was silent, seemingly unaware of the name of that place. Then someone remembered, "That's an area where no battles have occurred because cockatrices live there, and other species don't want to approach. It seems that none of us know the name of that area." Hearing this, Rakrak tapped the ground gently with his stick. "I know this land. Though surrounded by mountains, it would be easy to clear a path by removing vines and small trees. Deep in the mountains there's a river connected to a valley, and downstream is a flat, wide land that leads to the sea behind it. Isn't that the place you mentioned in your dream?" Rakrak nodded. "Yes, its name is Orizon. It means land where our god stands. According to his will, I shall become the king of Orizon." Hearing this, everyone was filled with joy and anticipation. Rakrak then gathered the tribespeople and announced, "We will go to Orizon." Looking at the land beneath his feet, Nebula exclaimed, "After planning for so long, we've finally taken this step." However, some held opposing views. Establishing a nation requires extensive preparation, and the capital had already been decided to be in Orizon. Rakrak announced this widely and opened a road to Orizon, facilitating the tribe's migration. He also dispatched administrators, naming them war chiefs. These war chiefs, armed with swords and holding codes of law, were responsible for managing the order of the new territory. Nebula was satisfied with Rakrak's arrangements and appointed Weekyung and Leonar as marquises, sending people to coordinate with them. Although all this seems primitive and clumsy, the embryonic form of a nation has already emerged. Meanwhile, the system notification reads, "Your nation has entered early monarchy." Eldar stood frozen. She hadn't expected Nebula to adopt both systems simultaneously. "When I weigh the pros and cons to decide what's best for the current situation, I have no choice but to use both." "But why are you making my species a part of your kingdom?" Nebula showed a hint of confusion, calmly stating, "That's my land too." Hearing this, Eldar fell silent. After the establishment of the nation by Nebula, Tatar was sent to the southernmost Maganen to serve as the war chief. Because life there was too mundane, he often remembered the days he fought alongside Rakrak. A young lizard man beside him chuckled in agreement. "Mr. Tatar is the best warrior. That's why you were also appointed as war chief." This made Tatar scoff at himself. The best warrior who lost an eye became useless, so he was sent here to quietly grow old. The young lizard man panicked. "I didn't mean that. I think Chief Rakrak wanted you to guard the land of Maganen, because it is now our territory. Such a life is boring. If something came from across the ocean, I wouldn't feel so." Before he could finish, he noticed something approaching from the sea. Then, a group of beings with green shells appeared before the two. Tatar carefully observed these newcomers from behind the bushes. Noting that they carried no weapons, he decided communication might be possible. Thus, he signaled the young lizard man to hide behind him. "Outsiders, I am the war chief of Maganen. Please state the purpose of your visit." "We are Turquoise Astacidines who've come across the ocean. We got lost because of the waves." At this moment, the The young lizard man behind him was extremely nervous because he had heard that Tatar was merciless towards foreign enemies. He had already prepared himself to fight the Turquoise Astassidines. Meanwhile, Tatar's penetrating voice rang out, "I see." Across the ocean, the Turquoise Astassidines were all drenched in cold sweat from the pressure of Tatar's presence. Then, Tatar gave a slight smile. "Prepare a temporary shelter for them, and if they're hungry, share some of the leftover food with them." This left everyone present utterly dumbfounded. The next day, after being treated by the Lizardmen, the Turquoise Astassidines expressed their deep gratitude for their help, and then they left. The young lizard man looked confused. Why help them? If it were me, I would have driven them away without hesitation. Tatar looked meaningfully in the direction the Turquoise Astassidines had left, and said, "Do you know how I lost my eye?" One day, he received an order from Rakra to carry out a mission. Along the way, he encountered some wanderers who had been captured and sold by trolls. Tatar chose to join the fight and single-handedly dealt with more than 10 trolls, but the price was that he lost an eye. In the end, he confessed his mistake before Rakra. However, Rakra didn't blame him. Instead, he said, "From now on, everyone will become your left eye. Don't you regret losing your eye for the people of other tribes?" Tatar's answer was, "I heard the leader wandered in the wilderness, guided by the blue insect god, but the blue insect god requires no reward." Rakra's eyes widened, seemingly understanding his meaning. "You mean, this was the will of our god?" Tatar lowered his head in shame. "Even without God's guidance, I would have done the same. Perhaps your actions were right." Then, Rakra advised Tatar, "Continue to act like that, and if anyone says you are wrong, let them know about this conversation we are having right now. Tell them that Rakra also agrees with you." A few days later, Tatar received news from the Turquoise Astassidines again, so he quickly went to the seaside. Rubwa greeted him warmly and explained that this visit was to purchase silk and iron tools from the Lizardmen. They brought the most valuable items from their tribe, some shiny stones as a trade. Tatar picked up one of the stones and examined them carefully, but was somewhat puzzled because he had no knowledge of their value. This was his first time seeing such items, so he was unsure whether they were worth trading. However, Tatar's attention was soon drawn to the Turquoise Astassidines' boats. He said, "I'm more interested in your ships than these stones." Rubwa looked troubled upon hearing this and said, "These boats are crucial tools for our survival, and it takes a long time to build one. If you don't like it, then no deal." Hearing this, Rubwa became anxious and said, "We'll bring an empty boat next time." Ultimately, the two reached a trade agreement, but they didn't notice a white bird perched quietly on a distant treetop, watching their every move. Meanwhile, the system notification window popped up with a message, "Clash of Civilizations. The cultivation level of Turquoise Astassidines is the Bronze Age. This suggests that it's unlikely that there is a player controlling them." Nebula recognized that the ship technology was quite advanced. If those shiny pearls could be traded across the continent, they would sell for a high price. But for Nebula, more valuable than the pearls was the shipbuilding technology. If we master this technology, we can start maritime trade, which will be a huge opportunity. Given the current level of their civilization, it is highly likely that the Turquoise Astassidines will become a subordinate nation to the Black Scale tribe in the future. At that point, it would be possible to start mining the silver deposits on their islands, which are a crucial basis for currency. Just as Nebula was deep in thought, a voice interrupted him. It was Hongo, a creation of Nebula. Hongo was created to manage the swarm of locusts, and Nebula had made it clear not to contact him unless it was something special. However, the situation now seems too significant to ignore. The true nature of the locusts has been exposed to other deities, and some of their nests have been destroyed. Nebula opened the window to check and found that indeed a few of his insect colonies had been reduced. Originally, Nebula had commanded Hongo to lead the locusts to stealthily infiltrate other tribes and consume their food to hinder the player's development. Experienced players quickly noticed these movements, realizing it was intentional interference. Despite this, Nebula appeared very calm. "Don't worry, this is all within my expectations." Hongo felt a wave of relief but still seemed somewhat tense. Nebula asked with concern, "How are you doing? If I lost you too, I'd be at a loss." Hearing this, Hongo quickly scratched its head and replied, "Although a few nests were destroyed, I managed to hide before they discovered me." "Good. Now, use the remaining locust swarms to disrupt the enemy. Survival is the priority. Stay hidden." Hongo bowed deeply to Nebula, then quickly exited the scene. Nebula then turned off the video. He did not want to have too much interaction with his creations. Unlike the AI of Lost World, these creations have their own souls and thoughts. Nebula then checked the battle results of the insect swarm. 5 players have been affected. If they discover that someone is behind this, they will definitely unite against me. He noticed that 2 tribes have already formed an alliance, while the other 3 players are still observing. I thought it would be a 1 against 5 situation, but it seems things are still under my control. On the other side, the leaders of the Leaner and Satiros tribes are conspiring on how to deal with the Locust Swarm. They have learned that the Locust Swarm is controlled by the Lizardman tribe, which has also taken control of Automation's trade. Although the location of the Black Scale tribe is close to them, both leaders do not want the other 3 tribes to step into their territory. The prophecy of the 5 deities tells us that our 2 tribes together can definitely eliminate the Lizardman tribe. If so, how should we proceed with the attack? The southern coastline is filled with swarms of insects, making it impassable. Another route is through automation, but it is also controlled by the Lizardmen. Then let's take automation back from the Lizardmen. If so, then even if it takes us a while, we'll take our forces through the northern wilds. A month later, they mobilized their armies toward automation. The two tribes assembled 800 Satiros warriors and 1,100 Leaner warriors. This expeditionary force of nearly 2,000 became the largest army on the third continent. The two players watched all this silently from above. The deity worshipped by the Satiros tribe, Krampus, a player ranked 1,430th, appeared somewhat nervous, asking another player, "How do you plan to supply the army?" The one who answered him was a woman who appeared quite unremarkable. She had long hair and wore a white off-shoulder dress. If she wasn't floating in the air, she would almost look like an ordinary human woman. "I'll have them plunder NPC villages along the way, and once they enter deep into the wilderness, they will bypass the northern coast." In contrast, Ronda, a player from the Leaner tribe, ranked 38,702 in the player rankings of Lost World, was still frustrated. "I still can't contact Nebula." Previously, she had been trying to contact Nebula, but a month had passed, and Nebula still had her and others blacklisted. "If we could have contacted him, we would have been fine with just being compensated for the damages up until now." He also blatantly increased his military training and scouting parties. "It's too late for negotiations now. An army of 1,900 is enough to take him down. His defeat is only a matter of time." At that moment, Krampus noticed the mole on Ronda's face, a feature that didn't necessarily have to be there. He wondered if her avatar resembled her real-life appearance. Just then, Ronda received a whisper request. It was from the player Eldar. "Our joint forces will definitely encounter members of the Elf tribe along the way. Perhaps she wants to negotiate, or she has other plans. Eldar's alliance with Nebula is a loose relationship. We could try to persuade her to betray Nebula. Maybe this conversation will create a rift between them." Ronda immediately clicked the accept button. A character resembling an elf with petal effects appeared on the screen. "I am the god of the elves, Eldar." This left Ronda momentarily dumbfounded, and she stammered, "Hello." Eldar's tone carried a hint of pity. "I need help." Neither of them expected that Eldar was a player fully immersed in role-playing. "What kind of help are you referring to?" Eldar quietly squeezed out a tear. "I had to submit under Nebula's oppression, but I couldn't do anything. He defeated players like Solonos and Lim Chunsik." Hearing this, Ronda was shocked. "You didn't help him defeat them? Don't you know Nebula's ranking in Lost World? He has always been firmly in the first place." This left both of them shocked. They had originally thought that Nebula's name was just a coincidence with that player, but now they realized that the first and second placers were actually on the same continent. "Anyway, I've been groveling to stay alive until now, so please allow me to help you." Ronda paused for a moment and then communicated, "If we are to trust you, we need information on Nebula. To gain your trust, I'm willing to provide everything you need." Eldar waved his hand, and all information about Nebula appeared. He also played the sympathy card. "You don't know how badly I've been treated under Nebula." Upon seeing the information provided by Eldar, both were shocked. "Nebula has taken too much from you." Eldar took the opportunity to say, "So I want you to help me defeat Nebula. Although I don't have an army to support, I know what Nebula is planning for this battle." Having relayed all the details, Eldar ended the whisper and glanced at the figure beside her. "Is that good enough, Nebula?" Unbeknownst to Ronda and Krampus, accepting Eldar's whisper request had already led them into Nebula's trap. "Your acting is really good. Is it because you've been playing roles before?" Eldar could only laugh awkwardly. "More than that, it is because the information she provided was so convincing." As instructed by Nebula, she told them that Nebula will launch a preemptive attack. Looking at the unconcerned Nebula, Eldar was worried. "But won't that not be enough to change the situation?" "Why do you think so?" "If the Leaner tribe decides to retreat and the Satiros tribe attacks automation, then the Black Scale tribe will be caught between them." Nebula directly dismissed her conjecture. "I will end the war with the Leaner tribe ahead of schedule." Eldar looked bewildered, already unable to guess Nebula's plan. "Do you still need my help?" Nebula smiled slightly. "Of course." Meanwhile, the Leaner tribe suddenly received bad news. Many soldiers suddenly got food poisoning. This made Hattie very angry, and he immediately drew his sword, but was stopped by the deputy commander, Yubei. "Until yesterday, there was no problem with the food. The issue started with the food supplied by the elves this morning. They look fresh on the surface, but they might contain poison." Yubei quickly guessed that this might be a tactic of the blue insect god. It's rumored that the blue insect god excels at controlling insects, and the elves and lizardmen are allies. At the same time, a subordinate rushed in, interrupting them, as a large army of lizardmen was spotted ahead, with at least 1,000 or more. This left Hattie conflicted, as too many soldiers were sick to fight, with only 900 able to battle. Even with equal numbers, their size puts them at a disadvantage. Now, outnumbered as well, defeat is certain, so Hattie immediately ordered a retreat, deciding to lead the troops into a nearby forest to use the terrain for guerrilla warfare. The massive Leaner army changed direction, Hattie only hoping that the Satiros tribe would attack automation soon, which would make the Lizardmen go back for support. However, just then, a dark figure suddenly blocked their path. A giant mantis had already ambushed them on their essential route. "Dare to step into the territory of the blue insect insect god, and you shall be punished. The sudden appearance of the giant creature panicked the leaner soldiers. The next moment, huge rocks fell from the sky. Seeing this, Hattie quickly signaled his soldiers to abandon their supplies and retreat, but Yubei stopped him. No, we need to defeat that monster. Yubei, that's not just any monster. It's definitely the guardian of the Lizardmen. We can't defeat it. Then, a fast-moving figure approached. A giant rat suddenly appeared in front of the leaner soldiers. This was the guardian beast Ronda had sent to the leaner tribe. Seeing this scene from a distance, Ronda's face changed instantly, especially when she saw the Mantis guardian, Shradis. She was restless because Shradis's attributes were far beyond her expectations. Her own summon could not possibly defeat it. She had thought everything would go smoothly as before, but now hesitated. Should she run? But she knew well, if she fled now and Shradis regained his senses and attacked back, they would undoubtedly lose. So, she decided to take a gamble. Although Shradis's level was high, its divinity level was only level 4. Together with Niji, our divinity levels add up to 12, and we still have a chance to win. The next moment, a powerful energy entered Yubei's body. Hattie realized that their god had descended. Yubei ordered all troops to retreat, as she was going to face this colossal creature alone. Niji tried to persuade her master to leave, but Ronda did not want to lose her summoned creature. You have no divine intermediary. It seems your god doesn't value you much. Shradis didn't heed her, merely responding coldly. I'm just here to complete a task. As Niji and Shradis were fighting, Yubei took the opportunity to get under Shradis's feet, hugging his thigh tightly. With divine power, she forcefully tore off one of Shradis's legs. Despite the extreme pain, Shradis didn't stop, instead delivering a heavy punch to Niji. You damn insect, to endure such pain for my god, shouldn't it be considered a blessing? Hearing this, Yubei realized this guy was simply a fanatic. Just as she thought she could defeat Shradis within 10 minutes, a figure as quick as lightning was rapidly approaching the battlefield. Rakra, carrying the 12th level divine power added by Nebula, stepped into the battlefield. With a roar, Rakra leapt up, his spear already aimed at Yubei. Found you. The spear tore through the air, directly aiming at Yubei. Yubei tried to dodge, but still felt a strong oppressive force. She was still hit by the spear in the arm, and blood immediately spurted. Seeing her master wounded, Niji immediately lunged at Rakra. However, a sharp claw quickly extended, firmly locking Niji's movements. With a forceful swing, Shradis flung Niji several meters, crashing heavily to the ground. Subsequently, Rakra summoned Buzz to lend his power, intending to completely resolve this troublesome little mouse. Rakra pointed towards Niji, and Buzz quickly gathered all his power. A bolt of lightning suddenly split the sky, striking directly at Niji. The current passed through its body, causing it to be immobilized, blood leaking from the corner of its mouth, yet it still stubbornly muttered, "Even if you are a god, you can't stop me." Before the words fell, another stronger bolt of lightning flashed again, instantly illuminating the surroundings. When the light faded, Niji had been burned to a crisp, completely losing its combat capability. Seeing this, Ronda was furiously enraged and wanted to curse aloud, but her words were choked back. She realized that although divine possession enhanced her physical responsiveness, it came with fatal risks. Ronda hurriedly tried to cancel the divine descent, but found there was still a 10-second cooldown. She was forced to make a life or death decision. If she died while in the state of divine descent, she would suffer additional penalties. Ronda was known to her race as the Supreme Fruition God, which was the first domain she acquired. Quickly, she found a fruit in the nearby bushes and ate it. The power of the fruit began to work, healing her wounds at a visibly fast pace. However, just as she thought to use the fruit's healing power to buy time, a swarm of locusts suddenly appeared, completely blocking her escape route. These insects did not attack her directly, but formed a barrier with their bodies, completely blocking her view. Just then, Shradis's scythe aimed precisely at Ronda's position, but she was already alert, determined internally. All I need to do is dodge its attack. Yubei's body quickly leapt in the opposite direction of Shradis, but in the next instant, a powerful hand brutally grasped her throat. "So you're here," Rakra taunted in a low voice. Yubei struggled desperately, staring at the countdown which had only 1 second left. She clenched her teeth and roared internally, "Damn it, hurry up and end." However, her hope dissipated into thin air. Time was no longer on her side. Blood poured from her neck, drenching the battlefield, staining the ground red. This outcome was hard for the confident Ronda to accept. She witnessed her own creation, Niji, die miserably, and now even Yubei could not escape her fate. The leaner's army was reduced from 1,100 to 215, completely breaking their morale. Yet the worst was yet to come. Ronda found that her divinity level had dropped from 9 to 5. Had she cancelled the divine descent earlier, it would have dropped only to 7. This irreparable loss left her heart sinking into despair as the battlefield smoke lingered. At the same time, Krampus made a call. Learning that Ronda had lost the battle, he inquired about her current divinity level with concern. Ronda hesitated, then answered, 7. This response shocked Krampus, his tone clearly uneasy. By this time, Ronda was already sweating profusely. If he knew the actual situation, he might be even more panicked. She was well aware that a drop in divinity level would not only lead to a decrease in faith points, but could also directly affect the yield of her orchard, potentially destroying it entirely. Under such circumstances, the leaner tribe might lose faith in her. Even worse, Krampus might change his attitude towards her. To avoid these consequences, Ronda decided to hide the truth. She changed the subject, asking, "Is the Satyros tribe on their way to attack?" "Yes, they'll reach automation in 2.5 days. The city's defenses are weak now, a perfect opportunity to capture it." Ronda pretended to be calm and responded, "So I just need to divert the Lizardmen's attention for 2.5 days, right?" Krampus affirmed this. However, at this moment, Ronda was struggling internally. Should she tell him the truth? She knew her forces could not delay the Black Scale tribe's soldiers, but she was unwilling to admit defeat and chose to conceal the truth. "I can't be the only one who gets defeated." The next day, Krampus contacted Ronda again, his tone tinged with unease. "I heard the Lizardmen forces are coming down this way. I thought you were going to keep them busy." Ronda immediately understood the true situation but still chose to lie, calmly responding, "It might be that the information from Eldar was inaccurate, causing them to encounter the Lizardmen's army prematurely. I originally thought the battle would occur in Black Scale Continent, but it started in my territory instead. And now, the Lizardmen are closing in on the Satyros tribe's territory." Krampus furrowed his brows, beginning to sense something was amiss. The Satyros tribe's border doesn't have any defensive fortresses, which doesn't make sense. This means they can't stop the Lizardmen's cavalry, so now they must retreat to the capital. However, Ronda had already foreseen what would happen at the Satyros tribe's capital. The Satyros tribe's 800-strong army, facing 1,700 Lizardmen and the formidable Shradis, were bound to lose the battle. At this moment, Ronda was already considering new allies. That guy Wisdom, he should be a good choice. Krampus was unaware of Ronda's thoughts and suggested she provide some support. This made Ronda panic internally, quickly making up excuses to brush it off. She rubbed her forehead, trying not to show any signs of distress. If she didn't help Krampus immediately, it would look very suspicious. Damn it, at this rate, he's definitely going to find out. The next thing Krampus said made Ronda even more anxious. He proposed that Ronda send cavalry to support his attack on automation. "You said the enemy lost 400 men. Now they have about 1,300. So, 300 of my Satyros, along with 800 of your Lenars, should be enough to match the Lizardmen. Plus, you said you killed Nebula's creation, so the fortress's defenses should be secure." Ronda didn't speak, only using a smile to mask her emotions. "Damn, I've told too many lies. If the lies are exposed, my alliance with Krampus will be over." Just then, Krampus suddenly exclaimed, startling Ronda. "It's a whisper request from Nebula." Ronda quickly intervened. "Don't answer it." But it was too late. Nebula's figure appeared in front of them. "So, have you started considering surrendering now?" Krampus was taken aback, thinking Nebula was just being arrogant. Seeing Krampus's reaction made Nebula puzzled. Then he glanced towards Ronda. He quickly guessed Ronda's intention. She lied to protect herself, downplaying the extent of her losses, so she has been hiding the truth from her own allies. If that's the case, it makes things more interesting for me. Facing Nebula's attitude, Krampus was very angry. "Why have you been blocking our whispers? Why decide to contact us now all of a sudden?" Nebula felt sorry about this and said lightly, "Because I have my reasons." Regarding Nebula's suggestion for surrender, Krampus directly refused. However, Nebula didn't mind because all this was within his expectations. After Nebula hung up the video call, Ronda was already sweating profusely, her heart pounding, but the worst outcome she had feared didn't occur, so she could only laugh and soothe the angry Krampus. Then, she changed the subject. "I want to check on my troops. I'll contact you later." Then she ended the whisper. Ronda immediately requested a whisper with Nebula, but received no response. At this moment, Nebula was calculating his gains, completely ignoring Ronda's whisper request. Nebula intentionally left Ronda hanging for a while. However, Ronda's thick-skinned nature indeed exceeded his expectations. Looking at the messages she sent, Nebula finally decided to accept the request. When the video connected, Ronda jumped out and yelled, "You piece of shit. What do you really want? What's there to be angry about? I should be the one upset about being suddenly attacked." Ronda was very dissatisfied with this and countered, "You haven't suffered any losses, have you? But being almost attacked is still very upsetting. If you called just to argue, then I'm hanging up. Goodbye." Then, he directly ended the call. This left Ronda dumbfounded and fuming, and she immediately initiated another whisper request. "What now? I'm not your friend, so don't treat me like that. What is it that you want? Can you ask me calmly instead of crying?" Feeling almost explosive, Ronda struggled to suppress the urge to scream and continued, "Why did you end the call when Krampus didn't surrender? I originally planned to end all this by having him surrender, but now, I think it would be better to destroy these two nations and conquer all their land. Although this will require some effort on my part." Ronda immediately pointed out the flaw in his plan. "You can't protect your own borders, because with your current population and level of development, it's just not sustainable." But such problems were obvious to Nebula. He calmly responded, "I can take over the land of the Satyros tribe and give the leaner tribe's land to the other 3 players. They would be happy to reap the benefits. But what if I and Krampus start a rebellion? Other players might take advantage of the chaos to attack you." Nebula's expression suddenly became serious. "I think you're misunderstanding something. When did I ever say that I'd leave you and Krampus alive?" This statement drastically changed Ronda's complexion. From then on, Nebula's ruthless image was deeply engraved in her mind. Combining this with her past experiences, she realized that Nebula would indeed eliminate them from the game without hesitation. But she also knew that Nebula didn't just have this one option. Ronda suppressed her temper and asked, "So, let's get back to the first question. What exactly do you want?" "Information about the Leaner tribe and Krampus, as well as information on the trolls. I can talk about Krampus, but Wisdom is not my ally." "I think you misunderstood me. I want you to ally with Wisdom to obtain information. How you do it is irrelevant to me." Ronda's expression turned even uglier, and her view of Nebula was updated once again. "You want me to be a double agent? To approach Wisdom and Krampus to dig for information?" She pounded the window with her fist, furiously saying, "Stop joking. Do you think you're superior just because you won once?" Nebula extended a finger towards Ronda's face and said coldly, "Your lies are the problem. I don't need to do anything else. I only need to tell Krampus the truth about our fight and warn Wisdom not to ally with you because you're a liar. You will be isolated by your 4 allies. Then, how will a level 5 deity stand in the center of the continent?" At that moment, Ronda was furious, but helpless. Then, she ended the whisper and started thinking about her next plan. "Let me think. There must be a way. There must be." Soon, Ronda arrived at the capital of the Leaner tribe, Minan. Located far from the border, the Lenars felt no fear of the impending war. Meanwhile, a Leaner person was praying. This wasn't a prayer about war, but a thanksgiving to their god for allowing him, a carpenter, to safely complete his work for the day. As the prayer ended, Ronda's faith points increased by 1. She closed her eyes and pondered for a moment. Damn it. Eventually, Ronda requested another whisper with Nebula. "I accept your proposal." Nebula revealed a smile. "Then, let me first hear the information about the Leaner tribe and Krampus." After the war with the allied tribes ended, Krampus seemed to struggle with accepting Nebula's proposal, but under Ronda's persuasion, he had to compromise. Ronda had driven herself to this point. No matter the cost, she had to prevent the truth about this battle from being revealed. Meanwhile, this multinational war unexpectedly spurred rapid commercial development. Thus, Wee Kyung invited representatives from various merchants across the Black-Scale Nation to attend this gathering and took the opportunity to establish a commercial alliance. However, the biggest challenge was the issue of trust. Every merchant came from a different tribe, and they worshiped different gods, which clearly wasn't conducive to the development of the commerce alliance. Although we can't change our species' differences, beliefs can be changed. The troll was curious about how Wee Kyung would resolve the disputes over gods. Then, Wee Kyung pulled out a die. "Isn't it more convincing to decide this way?" Meanwhile, a notification box popped up. Through Wee Kyung's leadership, the Merchant Alliance, the 5th wheel, has been created. Nebula watched everything happening in the Merchant Alliance through the window. "I didn't expect Wee Kyung to use her demonic probability control to roll the highest number. That's quite shameless. According to the current situation, the national borders will not change significantly in the short term. Next, it will be a war of the business era. Before that, I also need to make preparations for what comes next." After this period of development, the civilizations of various players in Lost World have gradually evolved. During this phase, beyond meeting basic needs, various items promoting the development of civilization have also emerged. At this moment, Rakra is holding a piece of thin paper, a trophy obtained from the routed Leaner soldiers not long ago. The Black-Scale tribe's craftsmen developed new technology based on this paper. Jill suggested using it instead of silk, as paper is cheaper and more practical. Rakra immediately inquired about the difficulty of production. Jill, swaying his tail quietly, answered, "We have water wheels that save a lot of time, and the paper can also promote the spread of writing." Rakra, looking at the paper in front of him, fell into thought. If the paper wears out, the text can be copied onto another sheet, but if the original record is completely damaged, it cannot be restored, and paper has its limitations. Then, Rakra glanced at Jill. "I have brave warriors in the protection of our god, able to fight and defeat any enemy. If the enemy attacks in 2 groups like before, we can just manage. But what if there are 3 or 4 groups of enemies? Neither you, I, nor the gods could be everywhere at once." Rakra picked up a piece of charcoal and drew a line on the paper. "This is the barrier I plan to build." Jill carefully examined the defensive line and after a moment of thought said, "But constructing such a long barrier would take a long time. We don't have mud soldiers like in automation, and considering the problem of materials, it might take 100 years to build. I thought it might take 200 years. However, Rakra was not planning to give up this idea. He quickly thought of combining geographical advantages, such as swamps, rivers, and other natural barriers. Jill, after some calculations, replied, "In that case, it should only take 70 to 80 years to complete." Although both of Rakra's ideas were dismissed by Jill, he did not give up. "The purpose of the barrier is to delay the enemy's invasion. But what if we think the opposite? Not delaying the enemy, but assembling our troops faster?" He then drew several fortress-like patterns on the paper: fire and smoke. One of the 5 must always have a fire lit. It means peace. 2 means that an enemy has been discovered. 3 means said enemy is heading this way. 4 means that the beacon has been intruded. 5 means that a battle has begun. Jill expressed approval after hearing this. To make the beacon towers more conspicuous, Rakra decided to build them on mountain ridges. After drawing, the beacon towers formed a defensive line. He asked Jill again, how long will it take to complete this? After a moment of thought, Jill answered, it can be completed within 5 years. 3 years later, the royal palace of the Black Scale Kingdom was beginning to take shape. Those residents whose houses had been built started to retrofit their floors to replicate the palace's heating system. For the Lizardmen, overcoming the cold is of utmost importance. At this moment, Rakra sat alone on the throne in the hall, pondering recent changes. The development of the Black Scale Kingdom had been smooth, facing not too many troubles, but he knew well that maintaining a nation was harder than establishing one. It was not only necessary to guard against foreign enemies, but also to keep tight unity internally. Species other than humans harbored deep fears towards Lizardmen, and this fear was not wholly beneficial for ruling a nation. Isn't there a way to unite everyone's hearts? Isn't living on the same land enough? Just then, a voice interrupted his thoughts. Yes, though they live on the same land, they are not living in the same time. Seeing the lizard man in front of him, Rakra stood up happily. Stargazer, weren't you already dead? Rakra was very surprised and had many questions to ask him. However, Stargazer only raised his index finger to his lips, signaling him to be quiet, and indicated not to ask further. Rakra understood that many secrets might be involved here, so he remained silent. What do you mean that we are not living in the same time? Stargazer didn't answer, but glanced outside through the door. Rakra followed Stargazer out. It was a night dotted with stars. Do you see the same shape of stars whether you stand in Maganen, across the wilderness, on Leaner, or Satiros people's land? Rakra gazed at the sky, realizing for the first time that every piece of sky looks different. The shape of the sky is the same, but everyone has their own time. But that's not enough, especially for you. As a king, you need to live in everyone's time. Rakra pondered. Under Stargazer's hints, Rakra gradually understood his meaning. That is to let everyone use unified time. However, Rakra felt this plan was difficult to implement because other species harbored hostility towards the Lizardmen. Stargazer smiled, pointing at the stars in the sky. That's why I came back here. He pointed to the brightest star and said, the brightest one there is you. Then, he used his hand to connect the nearby stars in a line, symbolizing Rakra's existence. Rakra asked in confusion, what about those stars moving toward me? Stargazer compared them to Owen. It pauses briefly, then continues to spread new stories for you. After hearing Stargazer's explanation, Rakra found it very interesting. He was amazed that Stargazer could mention names relevant to them. After a while, Stargazer said, I need to leave now. I have been here long enough. I can feel our god calling me. However, Rakra still had many questions he wanted to discuss with him. Aren't you curious how many kids I have? That's the business of the living. Then what about the afterlife? Can you tell me about it? That's the business of the dead. After saying this, his figure ascended into the sky, surrounded by a dazzling swarm of butterflies, and disappeared under the starry sky, along with the phantom of the blue insect god. Seeing this, Rakra devoutly saluted the void in respect. Just then, a voice called his name, pulling him back as he opened his eyes. A servant stood beside him and said, it's time for the meeting. Your vassals have arrived. The morning sun shone through the cracks of the window, and Rakra immediately ordered his servant to bring a large enough piece of paper and some charcoal. I want to depict the knowledge Stargazer brought. Meanwhile, an information window appeared in front of Nebula, indicating Third Continent Green Cidiac. The first calendar, the Hunting Star calendar, has been created. Seeing this information, Nebula was very pleased. He had been thinking about establishing a calendar since discovering Stargazer and didn't expect it to be realized so quickly. However, every time Stargazer spoke, Nebula's heart bled. The faith points are dropping like a waterfall, but having achieved this so quickly, Nebula also acknowledged Ronda's contribution. Since his leaner tribe also supported the calendar, Ronda nodded with a frown. Seeing this, Nebula encouraged her to cheer up. After all, this is the first calendar in the Lost World. Ronda sighed helplessly. I just told one lie, and now I'm almost becoming your vassal. Regaining his composure, Nebula asked Ronda what she needed. Ronda's originally angry expression instantly became calm and serious. It seems a new force has emerged in the center of the continent. Nebula was puzzled. How can a new force emerge out of nowhere? I think it's another player. Her reasoning was based on a clash of civilization notifications she received. Two divided tribes have come into contact. Both tribes will experience a great increase in EXP. Warning, the opposing tribe possesses faith. Nebula fell into thought. This seems very unreasonable. It's impossible for a new player to appear in the center of the continent now. The game has been going for 22 years. A player who hasn't made any moves until now suddenly appeared. Ronda and others tried to communicate with this new player but were rejected. After a moment of contemplation, Nebula became skeptical of Ronda's news. Where did you get this fake news from? Ronda then sent him the information she had about the new player. You got the info I shared, right? This is from player AR1026, whose main species is Nixon and has formed a loose alliance with me. She also sent this message to Krampus in Wisdom. Nebula looked at the information and felt it was highly improbable. He then asked, what's the new player's name? Ronda said her name was strange, as if randomly typed out. The first is the Hanja Jill. We took the next two characters to call this player Jill Woy. Nebula originally thought this might be a player seeking an unusual username or just a system error, but what followed was truly baffling. The appearance of vampires vampires in the world. He had played this game for so long and had never heard of a vampire race. With this, Nebula had to consider a possibility he didn't like: the existence of DLC. Strictly speaking, the Lost World they had previously played was not exactly the same as the current game. The key difference was the lack of graphical options. The options window was empty, with no configurable content items available. After listening to Nebula's explanation, Ronda agreed. At this moment, Nebula suggested that a few others go ahead to scout because those vampires looked somewhat dangerous. Although the vampires seemed like a weakened version of zombies, they retained their own consciousness. Ronda resisted a bit after hearing this. Currently, 5 of us have already split into 3 factions, and I really can't bring myself to approach AR. After all, she's an enemy to me. That's true. Okay, let's see each other again later. This left Ronda puzzled. By then, after Ronda left, Nebula continued to study the information before him. This is abnormal. Meanwhile, atop the mountain, 5 players opened their communication windows in sequence, clearly gathered together to discuss and decide on the sudden changes. They were discussing whether to invite Nebula. The man wearing a lion mask expressed his confusion. Do we really need Nebula's help? At that moment, a woman dressed in Rococo-style attire with a bridal veil spoke. After all, we can't invite Hegemonia because Hegemonia would use aid as a pretext to send troops. Next to the woman, the demon Krampus interrupted their conversation. In my view, Nebula and Hegemonia are the same kind of people. But Ronda compared them and said, Nebula is somewhat easier to communicate with than Hegemonia. Well, if that's what you think. Meanwhile, a man with a star-shaped head reminded the group, we're in contact. The next instant, Nebula's window appeared before them. Everyone is looking for me. Didn't expect I'd be this popular. Hearing this, other players displayed annoyed expressions, because most of them had been disrupted by Nebula's insect army at one time or another, particularly Ronda and Krampus, who suffered significant losses. Wisdom, whose face remained expressionless, spoke first. You should know why we've called you. Nebula then put on an act of feigning ignorance. I have a feeling, but it's not like predictions are always right. Seeing this, Ronda clenched her fists. She had already told Nebula all the information before this meeting. This guy really has no shame. Wisdom got straight to the point. A player we call Jill Woy has appeared with a race of vampires. Moreover, the vampires that only appeared in the Golden Eye Nation are now widespread across our 5 nations, forming a powerful force. Yes, I'm aware. Now that everyone was aware of the situation, Wisdom directly asked Nebula, are you willing to help us? Why should I help you? Nebula's response brought the meeting of the 5 players to a stalemate. At that moment, Ronda was fuming internally. This bastard, here he goes again. Our food supply is unstable because locusts have attacked the fertile lands across the continent. We know you're the mastermind behind the locust swarm. Nebula boldly admitted to this. But the war that Ronda and Krampus waged against me, hasn't that already ended? Jiangwan couldn't sit still any longer, interrupting the conversation. It wasn't even a proper war. Have you ever thought that we were going easy on you? Nebula saw Jiangwan's discontent but remained indifferent. My point still stands. If you're pissed, come at me. Wisdom immediately told Jiangwan to calm down. Nebula is intentionally being arrogant. Don't get worked up. Is that really the case? If we're lucky, maybe we can drive away Jill Woy's vampires on our own. But if we're unlucky, the vampires could develop into a bigger force. If it comes to that, we won't be able to negotiate for help. That's why we have to invite Nebula to join us. After hearing this, Nebula unreservedly affirmed his point of view. Indeed, but I could also just watch you slowly get destroyed. So, why should I help you? If our cooperation breaks down, it could become troublesome for you too, because dealing with one united person is harder than dealing with 5 fragmented individuals. Nebula looked at Wisdom without saying a word. Although he didn't remember the other players, he had a distinct memory of the ID Wisdom, who had been in the top 10 for several months during his peak. Thus, Nebula was aware that the gap in their capabilities wasn't very big, similar to his gap with Hegemonia. Nebula sighed helplessly. That's just your thinking. For me, dealing with one person is easy. So you mean you have no reason to help us? Are you saying you can't help us? That's not it. If I do help you, I need to receive the appropriate reward for it. What do you want? Nebula bluntly stated. I need 3 candle craftsmen, 3 glass craftsmen, 3 brick craftsmen, and 12 wagons of gold. Hearing this request, everyone was shocked. Such demands were indeed excessive, but Nebula did not back down. As I said before, if you're pissed, come at me. Helplessly, Wisdom asked Nebula to give them a few minutes to discuss. Then, Nebula's call was disconnected. Wisdom was a smart man. He knew how to persuade others. Sure enough, just 2.5 minutes later, they re-invited Nebula to the call and agreed to his terms, although they needed a few days to prepare. At that moment, Wisdom curiously asked, what's your plan to defeat Jill Woy and the vampires? You must have some plan in mind for you to have mentioned being rewarded. Nebula, resting his chin in his hand and staring at the screen, said, in mind? You're wrong. I've already started it. Months earlier, the Nixon were ravaged by the Null tribe. Some dark elves survived, but the Juman tribe's chiefess, Shaven's mother, was sacrificed. Her mother fought her life on the line and passed away, and the invisible root god chose another chief from a new family as a result of Shaven's family weakening. Now the new chief is trying to chase and kill them. Shaven felt ashamed before her mother and harbored resentment towards their god. She didn't know what her anger meant. Just then, a mysterious figure suddenly appeared before her. Shaven instinctively thought it was an assassin sent for her. Following this, the mysterious person threw something in front of her. To Shaven, who had been starving for days, these appeared like steaming bread and clean water. She began to devour them without hesitation. Shaven expressed that she was willing to do anything the stranger asked. Meanwhile, the mysterious person drew a sword from his waist and threw it on the ground. Shaven tried to resist, but her hands trembled uncontrollably as they reached for the sword. Realizing what was happening, Shaven understood that a new god had chosen her. "I will do as you wish, blood and rotten meat god." Just then, a notification appeared. The blood and rotten meat god has chosen Chief Shaven. The first vampire has been born. Meanwhile, Nebula was looking at the vampires. With just 6 months of development, the vampires had amassed an army of 6,000, 4,000 of whom were combat ready. The first to suffer was player AR-1026, whose nation, Juman, lost its capital and she was killed while possessing a creation. Nebula guessed her divinity level might now be only 4. If someone had helped AR-1026 eliminate the vampires when their forces were still small, perhaps things would have been different. It was only when other players realized the situation was uncontrollable that they decided to seek help from Nebula. Although it was late, they could still resist for some time. The vampire nation called White Fang, located in the center of the 5 players, mainly consisted of unmanaged weak groups. Their goal was clear: to seek revenge on the gods who had abandoned them, and these gods were the players before them. Hearing this, the players showed embarrassed expressions, but these problems were their own making and had nothing to do with Nebula. All Nebula needed to do was to tell them the 3 weaknesses of the vampires. Krampus was puzzled. Aren't there only 2? It was well known that vampires' weaknesses were sunlight and silver. Ronda nodded in agreement, but Krampus quickly thought of a 3rd weakness: vampires would gradually weaken with each generation. Nebula confirmed this, explaining that this was both a weakness and an advantage for the vampires. High-ranking vampires indeed had superior physical qualities, but their reactions to sunlight and silver were also much more intense. As generations passed, vampires' physical abilities would weaken, and some vampires became completely immune to sunlight and silver, but at the cost of their strength becoming ever weaker. At this moment, Wisdom didn't understand the meaning of Nebula's earlier words. Nebula had mentioned that he already started, but Wisdom, after observing, noticed that nothing recent had happened in the Black Scale Nation. "I'm not the one who moved but them. The White Fang has started." The players were stunned. They clearly hadn't fully grasped Nebula's line of thinking. Nebula, unwilling to play riddles any longer, lightly clicked on the screen, displaying a map magnified in front of everyone. This is the vampires' 3rd weakness. They had divided their forces into 4 directions, deploying 1,000 men each. Immediately, Nebula divided the map into 4 parts for everyone to see. Ronda was puzzled, as the content of these 4 maps was exactly the same. Nebula reminded her to pay attention to the dates. These are maps from 4 different periods. This means that the 4 vampire armies haven't moved for a long time. Maybe they are stopping to regroup? Would 4 armies rest at the same time? He further explained that vampire armies usually only pause briefly when pillaging villages, but these forces haven't moved since they last replenished their food supplies. Wisdom raised a question: how can you be sure they stopped for no other purpose? Nebula tapped his mask and said slowly, "It's simple. You were wrong from the start by treating vampires as zombies. There is a crucial difference between vampires and zombies. That is, they still possess consciousness. Vampire society is divided into upper, middle, and lower classes, and some individuals are forcibly transformed into vampires. Every vampire must obey their superiors, but this obedience weakens as the hierarchical gap increases." Although others still looked puzzled, Wisdom seemed to understand Nebula's point. That means they lack justification. The core of vampire unity is their inherent obedience. Initially, to obey or to survive, they must harm others. To live, they had no choice. But with the establishment of the vampire nation White Fang, this dynamic changed. The environment in White Fang allows them to continue living even without harming anyone. They no longer have any justification to fight and only have vague subservience left. This means that some of the generals don't want to face losses. It's as you say, some people start daydreaming once they are full. Thus, other vampire generals learn to watch and wait, observing each other, waiting for someone else to make the first move. Meanwhile, Juenra was personally transformed into a vampire by Shaven. During the attack on the capital, he was fortunate to become a vessel for divine possession. Thus, Juenra became Shaven's most trusted general. At this moment, he was puzzled as he looked at the map, noticing that the other vampire generals had stopped moving. Just then, he sensed a disturbance outside the door. The next instant, a ray of sunlight suddenly shot in from behind the door. Fortunately, Juenra quickly blocked the attack with his hand. Then, he forcefully threw a dagger, hitting the Satyros woman outside accurately, killing her instantly. When he looked down and saw the mirror on the ground, he realized that the sunlight had been reflected in. Following that, a man fully wrapped up entered. He was Shanghuan. Their relationship was like that of a general and his deputy. Juenra immediately shared his confusion with Shanghuan, who seemed to have already anticipated Juenra's perplexity. Not everyone will follow the will of the blood and rotten meat god. That's obvious. This Satyros was a follower of the life-proving god. However, Shangwan seemed reluctant to delve deeper. He slowly shared his view. Some among the vampires do not believe in the blood and rotten meat god. Juenra responded angrily, but it was the blood and rotten meat god who helped us in our most difficult times. Not everyone wants to become a vampire. Although the vampire queen carefully chose the first generation of vampire generals, the selection might not have been as careful from the second generation onwards. Perhaps their choice not to attack is to conserve strength, preparing for future plans. Juenra's expression was complex. Clearly, this answer was hard for him to accept. After White Fang was founded, we must fight the other generals in order to conquer even better lands. To do that, we need to maintain new forces. That's why they don't want to advance first and face losses. Hearing this from Shanghuan, Juenra suddenly had an epiphany. Then, he decided to launch an attack after sunset, as he wanted to prove to the vampire queen that there were exceptional generals. As Nebula had predicted, among the vampire generals, only one would obey the vampire queen without question. If they act now, won't that weakness become useless? By understanding vampire behavior, we can predict their next moves. For example, we can set traps that make them think they have an excuse not to proceed. If we use this method to delay the vampire's supplies, their army will quickly collapse. If vampires cannot get supplies everywhere, their army will disintegrate. Thank you, Starhead, for explaining so much to us. Wisdom corrected somewhat irritably. This isn't a star. Nebula looked puzzled. Then what is it? This is the great dodecahedron of the Kepler-Poinsot polyhedra. Hearing this, Nebula was silent for a moment, then apologetically said, "Sorry, I'll be more careful next time." He secretly decided never to mention Wisdom's head again. Then, are you going to create social division so the army of vampires are broken up? The method is effective, but slow, and as their army dissolves, the damage spreads. So, instead, I'll regroup them. Shangwan tilted his head curiously. Unify them? How? Nebula confidently answered, using myself as bait. Some guys are confident they can handle everything, then I'll give them a big slap in the face. Meanwhile, Juenra suddenly wakes up from his sleep because the soldiers report an enemy attack. He initially thought it was the Satyros' army, but found it was actually the Lizardmen. Just as the sun was about to set, the army of Lizardmen had already reached the vampire nation. Have you heard about Tatar? Of course, one soldier replied. Tatar is a warrior who defeated 10 trolls alone. Ur smiled, motivating his soldiers. Now, you also have the chance to surpass Tatar. The soldiers laughed at Ur's words, and one of them said, "But aren't you already a great general and an elite warrior? Do you know how to become an elite warrior? You need to be a bit greedy." The battle quickly began. Despite the vampires' large numbers, they seemed no match for the Lizardmen cavalry's charge. Juenra soon clashed with Ur, unafraid because he firmly believed the blood and rotten meat god would grant him strength. However, the battle between them quickly decided the victor. Ur raised the head of the last vampire he had slain and loudly declared to the soldiers, "I only killed 9 vampires because the other soldiers, after hearing about Tatar, desperately tried to kill more." The soldiers all laughed, and Ur continued, "This is the head of a vampire general, so it counts as 2, right?" But he was just joking. After all, keeping the soldiers' morale high was what mattered most. Soon, the news reached Shaven's ears. When Shaven heard the briefing, she couldn't believe her ears. General Juenra was dead, and about 400 vampires had died in battle. At this moment, Shaven was furious, but she was also puzzled. If the Lizardmen wanted to make a quick raid, they had to reduce their supply of military provisions, meaning they needed to obtain food locally. Suspecting that the Lizardmen had crossed so many nations to reach here, she wondered if the Lizardmen had formed an alliance with other nations. However, she quickly dismissed this idea. Shaven believed that Hukran Nation had no reason to help other nations. So, she speculated, was the king of Hukran Nation afraid of the rise of another major power? Although the Lizardmen had occupied many lands of the vampire kingdom, these places, even if occupied, would not truly belong to them. Shaven realized the current situation only after receiving intelligence from the scouts she had sent. Although she had already issued orders to the remaining 3 generals, their forces were still stagnant. Now, Shaven had to make a decision between 2 options. Was it to reorganize the remaining 600 defeated soldiers to face 300 Lizardmen, or call together the remaining 3,000 soldiers, making a force of 3,600 to counterattack Hukran Nation? But she knew the main strength of the Lizardmen was cavalry. They could continue to move around this domain without launching a direct attack. At this moment, Shaven was deeply conflicted. Just then, the blood and rotten meat god gave her an answer. A red moon hung in the eastern sky. Shaven understood. This was the guidance of the blood and rotten meat god. She immediately ordered her adjutant to gather all the soldiers. "We will attack Hukran Nation now." Just as Nebula planned, he successfully gathered the enemies in one place. But at this moment, other players felt puzzled. Are we supposed to perform a joint pincer attack on them? Although Nebula thought this was a good idea, he raised a crucial question. Do we have enough soldiers? Nebula's question left everyone momentarily speechless, as they had all suffered varying degrees of losses in previous battles. Although Zhangwan's troops could participate in the battle, they were too far from Nebula's Hukran Nation to be of immediate use. Only the forces forces of Krampus and Wisdom could truly be mobilized. However, Krampus could only send 500 people, and Wisdom's forces were even fewer, at only 300. Nebula deduced that if the vampires decided to attack Ukraine Nation, they were more likely to target the fortress near the automation rather than crossing the wilderness. From the vampires' perspective, it was hard to avoid sunlight in the wilderness, while the mountain paths provided natural shade, and they could also raid villages along the way to replenish their blood supply. Therefore, Nebula suggested combining his 300 cavalry with the forces of Wisdom and Krampus to pursue the vampire forces from behind. After hearing this, Wisdom asked, "But if we are too far apart, how can we truly coordinate a joint attack? From the current situation, Ukraine Nation must withstand the first attack alone. Do you think you can handle it?" Nebula's tone was filled with immense confidence. "Do you think I can't protect myself?" Wisdom shrugged. "As long as you think you can do it." Meanwhile, the other players were assigned their respective tasks. Everyone must do their utmost to eliminate the vampires within their territories. Xiangwan's troops need to recover the areas originally belonging to AR. It's not just about reducing the number of vampires, but more importantly, shaking their faith. However, what Nebula is most concerned about now is the player Jill Woy. He has yet to utilize his resources, and the territory of Vampire Kingdom has become the largest in the third continent, with the number of vampires rapidly increasing. As a player, Jill Woy's capabilities should not be underestimated. According to Nebula's calculations, his level might have already reached 17. Players gain a divine skill at level 16. This is the real reason Nebula fears him. If Jill Woy really is at level 16 or above and remains composed until the end, things will become very troublesome. But it's not entirely without solution. Meanwhile, Shaven led an army of more than 3,000 vampires to the automation. However, the sight before her was disconcerting. The way to automation had already been transformed by Rakra into a fortress that was easy to defend but hard to attack. The trees around had been cleared, leaving behind a hillside crisscrossed with trenches. The adjutant looked at the terrain and couldn't help but exclaim, "Only a honey badger could easily reach there." Unfortunately, they didn't have many resources at hand. Time waits for no one, and Shaven knew she had to act quickly. She immediately ordered to use the Lenars and trolls to approach the castle walls with large hammers to break them down. However, the adjutant reminded her that due to the terrain, if they attacked forcefully, at least half of their forces would be lost. Shaven pondered for a moment, thinking if they could make the slope gentler, it would facilitate the soldiers' movement. Suddenly, Shaven stopped in her tracks. A solution sprang to mind. "If we wanted to make stairs, why do we, the vampires, have to do the work?" Hearing this, the adjutant immediately understood her intent. Using slaves as meat shields for arrows not only reduces the enemy's combat resources, but also fills the slopes. More importantly, a rumor has recently begun circulating among the slaves. The 5 gods have abandoned them, but one god has not given up. Under Shaven's orders, batches of slaves were taken out. It's already the 3rd batch. At this moment, one of the rat people is terrified because they are next. Orizon is among them. Although he already knows the outcome, he still feels powerless to resist. They are just vampires, slaves, and food, and their gods have long abandoned them. Otherwise, why would they allow vampires to torture them like this? The recent rumors, however, have given some slaves hope. It's said that the vampires will go to war with the Lizardmen, and perhaps the blue insect god of the Lizardmen will save them. As time passes, it's soon Orizon's and his companions' turn. The other slaves are restless, anxiously looking at the situation in front of them, while Orizon remains silent. Although it's just a rumor, he has to choose to believe it, because, aside from this faint hope, there is nothing else in his heart to cling to. Below the city, the bodies of slaves are piled up like mountains. Although this is within Orizon's expectations, he is still deeply shocked when he actually sees it. Then, a vampire commander coldly says, "Your objective is simple. Run towards the gates of the Lizardmen's fortress. If the Lizardmen are the saviors as you believe, they will open the gates and save you." Orizon hesitates between 2 choices, but he knows he is powerless. The road to the fortress requires turning 3 corners to reach the gate, but Orizon notices that no one can get past the second bend. The vampires begin the countdown. All the slaves hesitate briefly. Orizon looks at the bodies beside him, knowing he must run first. One of the rat people tremble, afraid to move forward. However, what meets him instead is the vampire's cold blade. The moment the countdown ends, everyone is forced to start running. Then, several arrows whiz past Orizon. An arrow flies right past his ear. If he hadn't tripped accidentally, he would have been dead. However, the other slaves behind him are not so lucky. Shaven's satisfaction with the continuously running slaves made this plan seem like killing 3 birds with 1 stone. It not only reduces the Lizardmen's arrow supply, but also uses the corpses to fill the slopes, and simultaneously intimidates other slaves. However, the adjutant is somewhat worried. What if the Lizardmen really open the gate? Shaven is unconcerned. The Lizardmen are not fools, but if they really do open it, it might also be a good thing for us. The blood and rotten meat god is the only savior of this land. All other gods are just our enemies. Meanwhile, Orizon has reached the second bend. He is the first slave to get there. The arrows of the Lizardmen have stopped, but Orizon just stands there dazed. He knows the Lizardmen are unlikely to open the gate for him. him. However, the vampires behind him loudly warn him, "If you don't move, we'll shoot you from behind." Now Orizon is doomed either way. He can only move forward slowly. He doesn't understand why he must suffer like this. Why did he come to this world? Who can give him an answer? Just then, a blue butterfly flew up to him. The gate he thought would never open is now slowly opening for him. Time rewinds 2.5 minutes. The Lizardmen notice that the vampires are again sending unarmed slaves forward. The third batch now. Quetzal realizes the vampires' intent. They want to fill the slope with corpses to make their attack easier. Also, to achieve a quick decisive battle, the vampires have dispensed with surplus slaves. Rakra agrees, but points out that there's a deeper reason. Yura's gone through countless battles across the lands dealing with vampires. Such victories will become symbolic and spread to other nations. Therefore, the enslaved slaves see a glimmer of survival. Now the vampires want us to shoot those slaves who pin their hopes on us. If we refuse to help, they will fall into despair. This strategy will lead to slaves completely losing the will to resist. Looks like their commander is wiser than we thought. No, that's not the case. Rakra then ordered one of the guards to open the gate on his signal. Quetzal, puzzled by the command, asked, "Are you planning to save them? Those people may not be slaves, but weapons that the vampires have been hiding. That's why we shot the first 2 batches to verify whether they really carried weapons. Even if we open the gate, we can only accept a few dozen of people." Rakra smiles slightly. "Do you know why you lost to me last time?" Quetzal, "Your computational ability and logic are excellent, but your vision is not far-reaching enough. Learn to see the big picture." Meanwhile, a swarm of blue butterflies appears before Quetzal. The blue butterflies are seen as an oracle. Rakra and Quetzal know the butterflies are not just there to inspire them before battle. More importantly, their god have agreed with Rakra's approach, hence no one will oppose him. As the gate slowly opens, a boy is the first to rush in. Rakra then walks towards the gate, while Quetzal draws the silver sword from his waist to check if the slaves are vampires. Rakra reminds the soldiers not to aim at the slaves. As the gate opened, the vampires rushed in immediately behind it. However, Rakra showed no intention of avoiding them. He slowly walked outside, grabbed a Nyx woman, and threw her into the fortress. Quetzal caught her inside. At that moment, a vampire from behind lunged at Rakra. Rakra turned around, extended his palm toward the vampire, and a blue light shot out from his hand. Immediately, a bolt of lightning tore through the sky, lighting up the entire gate. Seeing this, Shaven muttered softly, "What a pity." Rakra quickly retreated inside the gate. The adjutant behind him quickly apologized to Shaven. "This is all my fault. I thought they wouldn't open the gate, so we missed the opportunity." However, Shaven didn't blame him. She calmly said, "Continue the siege as planned." In her view, the vampire army had a clear advantage over other armies. That advantage was that they were composed of multiple races. The Lenars are fast and skilled with most weaponry, and the Kobolds are small and nimble, which makes it easy for them to dodge their arrows. The Trolls, due to their massive size, could not ride any animals, but this was precisely their strength. They could keep moving forward under attack, showing incredible resilience. The Nixon and Satyros were the main offensive forces of the vampire army. Although the third-generation vampires had reduced physical abilities, they retained the traits of their original races, which was the key to Shaven's success so far. Shaven estimated that there were about 2,000 Lizardmen inside the fortress, while she had 3,400 vampires, so she was confident she would win the battle. However, as Nebula had predicted, Shaven didn't know how to effectively capture the fortress. The fortress's defense design came from simulations between Rakra and Jill, where they had already solved various potential problems. Meanwhile, the Trolls and Nixon took the lead in charging the fortress. Although the Nixon archers were excellent, the Lizardmen's bows had a longer range, and the height difference of the fortress provided a significant defensive advantage. Under the suppression of the arrow rain, the Trolls and Leaner's soldiers barely managed to hold on, attempting to climb the fortress walls. However, the Lizardmen were well prepared, facing the charge of the vampires. These physically strong vampires could withstand the arrow rain and reach the front lines of the fortress, but none could touch the gate. This was because a lightning lizard stood atop the fortress, and Rakra only needed to extend his hand for the vampires who managed to get near the gate to be struck down by lightning. Rakra, while smoking tobacco, looked down at the vampires lying on the ground, appearing completely at ease. He had simply used the necessary force to end this assault. Below, the vampires had all fallen, their bodies scattered across the battlefield. In this wave of attack, the vampire army lost 600 soldiers. However, Shaven insisted on continuing the assault. She swore to capture the fortress and destroy the Lizardmen. At this time, the bodies of the dead vampires piled up the slope, even filling it in. This sight terrified the remaining soldiers, who began to hesitate whether to continue charging, with some even turning to flee. To curb the fleeing behavior, the vampire general immediately executed a deserter to deter the others. Nebula observed the situation, knowing that whether Shaven chose to continue attacking or retreat, it would result in massive losses. If Shaven were a calmer commander, she might accept the reality of not being able to capture the fortress and choose to retreat. Is her fanaticism blinding her? At this moment, Nebula was more concerned that the player Jill Woy might intervene in the battle. He suspected suspected that Jill Woy was waiting for Shaven's forces to be completely exhausted before launching his own abilities. However, it seemed that Jill Woy had not noticed the turmoil happening at the rear of the army. Shaven watched the battle unfold far worse than expected and was furious. If she continued, she might lose all her soldiers. However, just then, a soldier hurriedly reported, "The trolls and satyros have joined forces with the Lizardmen." Upon hearing this, Shaven felt an unprecedented sense of crisis. She knew this was the enemy's tactic, but she was unwilling to retreat. "We've already lost so many soldiers. Instead of thinking about retreating, let's figure out how to take down the castle." However, just then, drops of blood fell onto the table. She wiped her nose with her hand and discovered it was nosebleed, making her expression even darker. Due to the slow and gentle heartbeat of vampires, Shaven had never experienced a nosebleed since becoming a vampire. Could this nosebleed be some sort of ominous omen? At the same time, the adjutant's call interrupted Shaven's thoughts. What has happened now? The slaves have revolted. Back then, the fourth batch of slaves had been brought back because the Lizardmen opened the gate. However, these returning slaves brought back shocking news. The blue-haired slave told everyone, "I saw blue butterflies. The Lizardmen opened the gate for us. Some of the slaves have entered the castle." However, many of the slaves were skeptical about this. They couldn't understand why the Lizardmen would do such a thing. "I'm not sure, but no matter the reason, I am going to fight." The rumors might be true. Vampires would eventually be defeated by the Lizardmen. Instead of helplessly waiting for death, let's resist together. Maybe we still have a chance to survive. His words sparked the slaves' desire to live. Their fighting spirit was completely ignited. Just as the vampires sent people to check the situation, the slaves had already begun to resist on a large scale. The adjutant urgently reported to Shaven, "This is no small matter. All the slaves have completely broken into chaos." Shaven was seething with anger, but quickly regained a strange calm and asked, "When you say all, do you mean all 1,200 of them?" "Yes, all of the slaves. The guards watching over them were all attacked. Although most of the slaves are unarmed, we don't have enough soldiers to stop them from leaving the camp. You have swords and spears, yet you can't stop unarmed slaves. The number of slaves in the camp far exceeds that of the soldiers, and these slaves are strangely hostile. Compared to usual, they don't care that they might die and are diving in to steal weapons." Hearing this, Shaven realized that Rakra anticipated this when he opened the gate. At that moment, the adjutant called to Shaven again, but noticed her nose was bleeding. "This cannot be the will of our god. I don't believe the god who chose me would treat me like this." Then, Shaven calmed down and ordered, "Tomorrow, deploy all soldiers to take down the fortress." "Lord Shaven, what about the slaves? If we send our soldiers outside to attack the fortress and leave these fleeing slaves behind, could they pose a greater threat from behind? If the enemy surrounds us, we surely won't hold out. I never said to let them escape." The adjutant, puzzled and about to ask further, was abruptly bitten by Shaven. Shaven's sharp teeth pierced the adjutant's artery, and blood sprayed from the bite. The adjutant, terror-stricken, fell to the ground motionless. After this, Shaven seemed much clearer mentally. "It seems I need to replenish my blood, probably because of my nosebleed." Then, Shaven glanced coldly at the generals present and said, "Do you still need me to personally dispatch troops to suppress the slaves?" A general immediately stood up, nervously stating, "There's no need for you to trouble yourself. I will use the station soldiers to prevent the slaves from escaping." Shaven affirmed this and turned to another general, commanding coldly, "From now on, you are my new adjutant. Go fetch my armor now. I will personally open the gate." Meanwhile, the vampires are resisting the rebel slaves. Seeing this, Quetzal was puzzled. Could it be that our reinforcements have arrived? Our reinforcements are still far from here. Moreover, vampires don't need torches, so it must be the slaves who've caused this ruckus. But why would the slaves rebel at this time? Rakra smiled slightly. "It'd be good to assemble the cockatrice warriors." Rakra then posed another question. "What if the vampires don't send soldiers to stop the slaves' rebellion?" Quetzal felt this hypothesis was absurd. How could that be? If that were the case, they would surely try to resolve the issue once and for all quickly. Correct. If it's confirmed that all slaves have betrayed them, the enemy will have to face being attacked from both front and back. Their only way to break through the gate might depend on their deity. After saying this, Rakra's gaze shifted to directly in front of the fortress. At this moment, Shaven, holding a sword, slowly walked towards the Lizardmen's castle. She shouted loudly, "Rakra, if you are not afraid, come out and fight me one-on-one." Upon hearing this, Quetzal immediately turned to Rakra and asked, "Will you fight? If I don't, the vampires will use the power of their god to destroy the gate. They are desperate." Before leaving, Rakra reminded Quetzal, "The slaves will soon appear from behind the vampires. When that happens, send out the cockatrice warriors to join forces with them and eliminate the vampires." Meanwhile, Shaven was calculating her plan. Once Rakra opens the gate and appears, the big weasels will immediately charge. Without the gate as a defense, they will also lose the advantages brought by the fortress and the terrain. However, things did not go as Shaven had planned. Rakra, riding a majestic cockatrice, stood imposingly atop the castle walls. This scene left Shaven dumbfounded. "How did you get up there on that?" Rakra, with a smile on his face, responded, "Don't you know that a winged cockatrice can fly?" With his command, Rakra and his cockatrice soared into the air and dove towards the ground. The cockatrice's talons aimed directly at Shaven, while Rakra brandished his long spear. At the moment when Shaven's sword clashed with Rakra's spear, she was knocked back by the immense force. Although Shaven's physical prowess could match most cavalrymen, she hadn't anticipated Rakra being so powerful. Before she could fully react, Rakra had already turned his spear around for a powerful strike aimed at her head. Shaven had no chance to use her fangs, nor could she get close to Rakra. She could only struggle to maintain her footing and try not to be knocked back. Rakra was no ordinary cavalryman, and with the swift cockatrice, his combat effectiveness was impeccable. Riding it, Rakra was a powerful 21-level warrior. Meanwhile, the slaves had successfully defeated the vampire general. They armed themselves and began attacking the enemy from behind. Victory seemed within reach. At this moment, a message popped up on Nebula's panel. Player Jill Woy requests a whisper. If it were any other player, Nebula would not entertain such a request, especially now with the tense situation in the battlefield. He would at least wait until after killing Shaven to consider having a conversation. However, the caller was an extremely suspicious player, Jill Woy, a mysterious figure who appeared years after the game started and controls the unprecedented race vampires in the game. After a moment's hesitation, Nebula accepted the whisper. The face that appeared on the screen was an ugly face stitched together from various skins. Nebula couldn't help but comment, "What a weird taste." The other party remained silent, making the atmosphere awkward for a time. Nebula was the first to break the silence. "How should I address you? So far, I've been calling you Jill Woy. Is that okay?" Jill Woy remained silent. "If you have nothing to say, then I'm hanging up." It was then that the other's mouth slowly began to move, with a low tone. "Do you think you've won?" Nebula responded without hesitation. "Of course. What else?" Jill Woy sneered, slowly saying, "You're wrong. You will lose." Nebula didn't understand where Jill Woy's confidence in predicting his defeat came from. From the current situation, Shaven was doomed to fail. However, Jill Woy interrupted his thoughts, coldly saying, "I'm not talking about those unintelligent, foolish, and lowly things. Are you talking about the battle currently taking place between Rakra and Shaven? If you descend, I can descend too." Jill Woy once again denied his view, stammering, "No, you can't change anything in this world." Nebula was momentarily confused. If the opponent really was a player, especially one from Earth like Nebula, their tone should be filled with anticipation for victory. However, Jill Woy's words sounded more like stating a fixed fact. Nebula cannot change anything. He decided to try to provoke Jill Woy to extract more information. "I believe I will win, and then I will be able to open up all civilizations. I will build temples in every city and excavate all ancient ruins." Jill Woy was obviously angered, raising his voice angrily. "That power does not belong to you. It belongs to us." Nebula instantly caught a key point. "He used us." This implies that Jill Woy might not be a player. Nebula followed up, "Just what is your identity? We are the masters of this world. Everything you owe us, we will take back." After that, Jill Woy ended the call. This guy's every move was bizarre, leaving Nebula bewildered. However, Nebula decided to set aside his doubts and focus on the situation at hand. Just as he was about to intervene in the battle, suddenly, a beam of light pierced through the void. Seeing this, Nebula was stunned. Meanwhile, Rakra chopped off one of Shaven's arms, and his cockatrice snatched the limb in its beak. Rakra then poised his spear and said to Shaven, "The battle should end now." Saying this, he charged at Shaven. However, just at this critical moment, Rakra suddenly sensed a dangerous aura. He immediately stopped the cockatrice action. The next second, a beam of light suddenly appeared between Shaven and Rakra. When Rakra looked up, he saw a giant hand holding a massive sword. The giant was too immense to see clearly. Only a vague outline was visible. Through the darkness, the deep red eyes were distinctly visible. Rakra understood that this was the god of vampires. Rakra, the Lizardman, was now facing a giant hundreds of meters tall. Nebula, watching this scene, realized that this was manifestation. This is a skill unlocked only when a player reaches level 16, allowing them to customize the appearance of a deity, with the combat ability depending on the environmental conditions of the deity's location. Looking at this gigantic figure, Nebula realized that even summoning his powerful creation, Shradis, to the battlefield would merely be scratching an itch. Meanwhile, Rakra was commanding the soldiers within the city, issuing an order, "Evacuate the city." This was a very wise decision. Facing a giant nearly 100 meters tall, even if thousands of people fired together, the end result would be futile. However, Nebula was aware that manifestation, compared to descent, required a lot more faith points, but there was no ceremony held now, meaning Jill Woy did not make sacrifices, and the giant had to draw offerings from surrounding creatures to sustain itself. The giant hesitated not at all to reach towards the direction of vampires and slaves, indiscriminately grabbing and devouring everything. Seeing this, Shaven's eyes widened in disbelief, her smile frozen in place. The giant's hand swept across the battlefield, revealing their god's indifference to friend or foe as he gorged on blood and flesh. In that moment, she understood that he was no different from her. With that thought, Shaven laughed loudly. Meanwhile, Nebula analyzed the situation, realizing he might lose some Lizardmen. Jill Woy could quickly restore faith points by devouring, but this would drastically reduce the number of Lizardmen in the city. If Shaven survives and captures the city, city, relying on the remaining forces, she would be unable to fully utilize the mountain fortress's advantages. Jill Woy clearly wasn't foolish. He would leave part of his army and might let Shaven roam the continent to somehow increase her military power again. This would cause more trouble for other players, but these were not within Nebula's considerations. At this moment, Rakra was quickly commanding the soldiers to evacuate the city. He didn't know when the evil deity would strike, but he had to be prepared. Quetzal stepped forward, offering to stay behind to stall the enemy. However, Rakra immediately rejected his proposal. What kind of leader abandons his warriors and flees first? For Quetzal, Rakra was not just their leader, but also their king and the beacon guiding the Lizardmen forward. But Rakra didn't think his life was more precious than that of other soldiers. Just then, an explosion erupted nearby. He suddenly realized that sacrificing himself would plunge the nation into chaos. At this time, Rakra and Jill had 3 children, and their future was the hope of the Black Scale Nation. I think I am not fit to be king. That thing hasn't even filled half of his stomach yet, and not even half of the Lizardmen have been evacuated. Yet Rakra showed no signs of backing down, his gaze steady on the evil deity's movements. If it continues to live, that vile vampire queen will surely survive by chance. Then, this war could drag on for years, even longer. Quetzal stood in front of Rakra, trying to persuade him, but ultimately, we will win. It's a victory bought at a great cost, but still a victory. Rakra just looked deeply at Quetzal and then said, Quetzal, you still need to learn a bit more about math. Quetzal hadn't yet reacted when Rakra grabbed him by the collar and flung him behind him. By the time he steadied himself and turned around, Rakra was already charging down the slope on his cockatrice. Seeing this, Nebula's face showed deep concern and disbelief. Why does he have to do something so foolish? I should just control him directly with descent. Nebula opened the interface for the descent skill, trying to forcibly take over Rakra's actions. However, a system prompt popped up. Your high priest is resisting the descent skill. Would you like to force use? Nebula clenched his teeth and eventually chose to cancel. He knew that if he used descent forcibly, Rakra will be frozen for a moment, and he might die during that time. Meanwhile, Rakra finally had a clear view of the immense creature. This must be the true form of their god. It looks absurdly strong. The evil deity slowly raised a giant arm, the massive hammer in its grasp aimed directly at Rakra. With quick reflexes, Rakra dodged the hammer's fierce swing. At this time, Nebula's heart was on edge. Rakra, what are you doing? Run away. Just then, a swarm of red butterflies appeared in front of Rakra. Blue butterflies symbolize good fortune. Thus, red ones are seen as an ill omen. This was Nebula's first use of red butterflies, and he believed Rakra would understand his message. However, Rakra ignored the warning of the red butterflies, bypassing them and pulling his bow to aim at the giant. Damn it, Rakra ignored my hint. The arrow struck the giant's face like a toothpick, which was inconsequential to the giant and only enraged Jill Woy further. Another giant hand raised a massive sword, slashing down at Rakra. Rakra, do you know what you're doing? You can win this fight if you just retreat. Return to the palace. You can live with Jill, the warriors, and your children. For the next decades, no warrior would dare challenge your throne. At this time, a system prompt appeared. Would you like to sponsor Faith Resources to the battle? Without hesitation, Nebula pressed the yes button. Instantly, Rakra unleashed lightning at Jill Woy. Though powerful, the lightning required divine power to cause significant damage to Jill Woy. Nebula tried using the descent skill again, but it was still rejected by Rakra. Is this it? Some of the Black Scale Tribe warriors will disobey the chief's orders when necessary. Is that why you, the chief, is also going against God's will with your own decisions? Using your one life to save more lives? Is that your damn math? Thinking that fighting him would decrease his manifestation time? You're saying victory isn't everything? At that moment, Rakra used the arrow as a springboard to leap into the air. At the same time, he said to Buzz, old friend, do me a favor. Rakra needed to borrow Buzz's power, continuously gathering strength, his spear wrapped in intense electrical currents, shimmering with a light as blinding as the sun. Then, this spear of thunder struck straight at the giant's head, instantly illuminating the entire land. However, Jill Woy is a deity. How could a mere ant shake him? Following that, Jill Woy picked up his giant hammer and slammed it down hard on Rakra. Thus, Rakra of the Black Scale Tribe, the Hand Hunter and Lizardmen of Thunder, the first chosen one and the chief of the Black Scale Tribe, the founding king of Hukrun and Great Thunder Dragon King, the model of Lizardmen, and the one who opened the path, and he who was more like a king than anyone else, who was known to be good at figures, fell. A notification box appeared. Your high priest Rakra has died. You have lost EXP. After Rakra was killed by Jill Woy was furiously swinging his giant hammer, wildly venting his anger. Nebula, standing in the background, clenched his teeth, momentarily at a loss for words. His mind went blank, and he fell into a brief stupor. However, he soon regained his composure and calmed his emotions. No, it's okay. The death of a high priest is acceptable. In fact, he had anticipated that something like this might happen. Therefore, Nebula had previously appointed Weekyung as the successor to the priest. Although there was indeed a loss of experience points, the divinity level had only dropped by 1 level. More importantly, Nebula still had the afterlife at his disposal. He only needed to summon Rakra's soul there, and not every everything was over. Meanwhile, the notification box indicated Rakra, who was respected by everyone, has died. Many are sad about Rakra's death. Is someone teasing me? However, Nebula was suddenly stunned by a message window that appeared before him. Entity Rakra has been enthroned as Apostle. Apostle Rakra has obtained a divinity level. At this moment, Nebula almost doubted whether there was something wrong with his eyes. Rakra became an apostle. Apostles are the beings that assist deities. When a god's creation grows, or when special beings like dragons become followers of a god, they have the opportunity to evolve into apostles. Sometimes normal entities can grow and become apostles, and this is called ascension. Apostles receive their own divinity, not only obeying the commands of their god, but also leading the spread of the faith. Nebula still couldn't believe it all, because he knew the conditions for ascension had not all been met. He could not infer the first 3 conditions, but he was sure the 4th condition had not been reached. According to the game rules, a player's divinity level must reach at least 21 to raise the limit of faith points to 1 million. But now, Nebula's divinity level is only 11, and he can only have up to 100,000 faith points. Thinking of his divinity level, Nebula hurriedly opened the panel to check his faith points. This look left him completely dumbfounded. The faith points were rapidly increasing. Compared to the speed of increase in faith points, the amount of faith points consumed to summon an apostle was even more astonishing. How is this possible? Where are all these faith points coming from? He quickly turned his gaze back to the center of the battlefield. At that moment, Jill Woy was still lashing at Rakra's body. However, in the face of the evil god, not a single person fled. The black-scale lizardmen, the vampire's slaves, even the vampires of White Fang Nation were all praying for Rakra. But even so, their prayers were not enough to generate such a massive number of faith points. Quickly, Nebula realized something. He seemed to have overlooked a crucial point. This was not the Lost World game of the past. Those windows were just a facade to maintain the appearance of the game. When faith will surpass the quantifiable limits of the system, errors may occur. At this moment, the rapidly increasing faith points were the best proof. So, am I witnessing a miracle that transcends the system's scope? Just then, another message window popped up. Your apostle Rakra is requesting advent. Will you permit? Does Rakra want to come back for revenge? Becoming an apostle is indeed a good thing, but I can't send him there just for revenge. Nebula opened Rakra's character panel, and a smile gradually appeared on his face. He is indeed very powerful. The abilities and skills of an apostle reflect the reputation and various titles they accumulated throughout their life. Becoming an apostle means becoming a legendary figure in epic tales. Nebula finally pressed the yes button. Do your best, Rakra. Meanwhile, as the last lizardman evacuated the fortress, all the lizardmen successfully retreated. Quetzal watched these fleeing lizardmen and said, "This is all thanks to Lord Rakra. His sacrifice secured everyone's safety." But Quetzal didn't know how to break the news of Rakra's death to jail. Up until now, many on the continent have been fighting just to fill their stomachs, but Rakra has left an indelible, significant mark on this land. The only regret is that Rakra didn't defeat the evil god. As everyone fell into silence, a clap of thunder broke the quiet. Quetzal looked up at the sky. However, there were only sparkling stars filling the void. No thunder could possibly be there. Then, a dazzling yellow beam of light suddenly descended from the sky, landing precisely where Jill Woy had hammered. People couldn't look directly at the blinding light of the beam, and they didn't even know what had happened. Seeing this, Jill Woy immediately swung his giant hammer at the beam. However, just before the hammer touched the ground, it seemed to hit something indestructible and was directly bounced back. At that moment, the entity that Jill Woy was attempting to strike finally revealed its true form. A lizardman, surrounded by golden lightning, appeared at the center of the beam. The lizardmen recognized him immediately. It was Rakra. He went through all that and didn't die. Jill Woy seemed unable to accept that Rakra had been resurrected. "You dare, a mere mortal." He swung all his sword at Rakra. However, as the sword were about to touch Rakra, he turned into a bolt of lightning, instantly piercing through Jill Woy's body. This left Jill Woy utterly baffled. Before Rakra died, he couldn't leave a mark on me at all. At this time, Rakra's character panel shows Warrior level 6, King level 6, Apostle level 13, Strength 167 plus 13D, Intelligence 155 plus 13D, Camaraderie 132 plus 13D, Will 287, Leadership 115, Deception 82, and Patience 74. Rakra's priest level has been transformed into an apostle level, and his capabilities have been unimaginably enhanced.